I'm about to show you a man who you probably don't know, but he's someone who you'll never forget.
If any of you out there don't go see this movie just because you don't want to sit in the theater for 3 hours, well, I hope you die a slow and painful death over exactly 3 hours.
This is George Wood. George Wood is what you might call a passionate nerd, someone who loves comic books and card games, so much so that in 1993 he created a show about them. And although it only ran for a few years on a small public access channel outside Washington, D.C., this show, later dubbed Gaming in the Clinton Years, turned into the best worst review show you will ever see.
First off, if this storyline is truly to reach epic levels, then I hope one of the lovers dies. We have a challenge to IDOS. In Tomb Raider 3, create a storyline in which Lara gets breast cancer. Why not have a game where you have to find and drive to the hospital before your wife delivers her baby? Now that would be fun. Hopefully you'll succeed. If not, oh well.
Yeah, it was a surreal sight to behold. You hardly went a minute without hearing some strange comment that was unintentionally hilarious.
Mario Kart 64 is fun to play, except when you're losing.
When this show made its way to the internet years later, it almost immediately developed a cult fan base, fascinated with its episodes and production. Yet in spite of its rise to near mythological status, not many people know how this show came to be and the weirdly inspirational story behind the mysterious man who started it all.
Public access, you can pretty much display anything from church sermons to self-promoting to, to promotion for a candidacy, or even if you want to show some porn. But I don't recommend that. But you can.
In the year 1969, America was in a really weird crisis in the world of television. TV had grown to become one of the most dominant forces in the American household, as more Americans than ever were watching TV, and for longer and longer periods of time. This naturally created a huge influence for the cable companies and broadcasters, which were starting to become a concern for the federal government. Specifically, the FCC was worried that TV wasn't being used to its full potential. It was being used to sell products and provided some mainstream entertainment, but the federal government thought this technology could be something more. So in their first report and order, the FCC created a new rule. Cable companies of a certain size were now only allowed to broadcast television in an area if they also operated a specific local outlet for local productions. In other words, cable companies now had to provide the general public with their own TV channel where any citizen could go and make their own content. Thus, public access TV was born. The idea behind all of this was obviously a pretty noble one. Average citizens could now go to their local public access studio and learn how television was made, learn how to film, write, edit, and broadcast their own shows. It gave power to the individual, letting anyone make their own content, sharing ideas or views that might not be the sort of thing that would ever get approved to be a show with a major broadcaster. It was almost like an internet before the internet. But of course, if you know anything about public access TV, you probably know that it became somewhat infamous for some weird and funny programming.
Get the face going on here, put the face going on here, get a lot of red on the face, got a lot of pink tones on there, get the face going on.
I'm starting off fresh and I feel good, I look good, I smells good, and this next call's gonna be wonderful. Goody! Fucking genie. Kiss my ass.
Yeah. Fuck you, you cockfucker. Hello? Hi, you're on the air.
Hey, why don't you tell us your name so everybody out there can know what an idiot you are?
And this is where our story begins.
Hello, my name is George Wood, and I am the host of Flights of Fantasy. This is the first television show dedicated to the world of collectible arts, comic books, cards, science fiction, horror, and the other aspects of our hobby.
In the year 1993, in the small suburb of Bowie, Maryland, a new public access show emerged named Flights of Fantasy. The show's host and creator was a strange middle-aged man named George Wood, who seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Like most others on public access, George had no prior experience or formal training in media. He just had an idea for a show that he wanted to share with the world. Specifically, his idea was for a series dedicated to nerd culture, mainly comic books. Acting as a half journalist, half entertainer, George would play host as he discussed trends in the industry, showcased upcoming releases, and interviewed industry professionals. Flight's episodes could vary in length, as a single segment in the show might be no more than a couple minutes, while a full episode could go on for 2 hours. But each episode was always filled with a pretty wide variety of content that sometimes was pretty good. Certain parts might be a laid-back panel debating trends, while others were real independent journalism that actually broke some news. The first few episodes really focused on comic books above all other subjects. It became clear that's what George cared about the most, as he would later claim to be a lifelong fan of comics with a personal collection of tens of thousands of issues. Each comic book segment gave George the ability to flex his knowledge on the medium, where sometimes he gave some pretty forward-thinking and progressive opinions.
Senior Morarte definitely sucks, and the whole comic book industry handling of minority, women, non-white male, certain age superheroes also sucks. So this gets the double suck award.
In fact, the entire show had a really great format, and in many ways, it was way ahead of its time. You'll find tons of podcasts today discussing nerdy niche media that aren't far off from what George was doing decades ago. Not to mention the talking head debate format with a panel discussing opinions on news. That's basically everything you see on television nowadays across a wide variety of channels and subjects. Flights may have varied in production quality over the years, but the ideas behind the show were honestly kind of genius. Really, the only issue that Flights ran into was a problem that wasn't really their fault. The 90s started off as a really great decade for comics, and made total sense as a subject for discussion at first. In fact, in 1993, the same year Flights debuted, more comic issues were sold than at any other point in human history. But those sales turned out to be a double-edged sword. Around that same point of time, news headlines had recently begun sweeping the nation about how old rare editions of comics were selling for millions of dollars. It turned out that is what was fueling this crazy buying. People weren't buying comics for the right reasons, they were buying them in droves in the hopes of finding a rare copy they could later sell for a profit. Publishers caught on to this and started encouraging it further by printing loads of limited edition copies that weren't all that limited, and before long, the entire industry was a bubble. That bubble eventually popped and nearly killed off comics altogether. 2/3 of independent comic sellers went out of business. Marvel went bankrupt. And everything even tangentially related to the industry was suddenly thrown into peril, including George's show. Flights of Fantasy's main draw was discussion of an industry that now looked to be at death's door. But rather than give up on his idea, George decided to pivot and start talking about the next monolith of nerd culture, video games. This is how Flights of Fantasy turned from a comic series into a video game review show. It was honestly a good move. Video games had just come out of their own recession in the 80s and were blowing up into the mainstream. There were a lot of people buying games and plenty more who wanted discussion about them. George had an opportunity to fill that void in the world of media, and in doing so, Flights of Fantasy became the very first video game review series on television. The only issue was George didn't know that much about gaming. Turns out he wasn't a super big fan of the medium, at least not in the way he was a fan of comics. You could argue this was a positive, since he was bringing a fresh view to the world of games, discussing viewpoints that veterans of the industry might not consider. You could also say, this is how we got the best worst gaming review show of all time.
A perfect mix of action and Academy Award-winning character development, Pokemon is a great game for the 12 and under crowd. We don't care about the multiplayer stuff. No one buys a game specifically for multiplayer options. Welcome to the overworld, home of dated PlayStation graphics. Buster Buddies includes famous paintings and works of art, like the Gleaners, shown here. These works serve as backdrops for each level. Being the silly people that we are, we were kind of hoping to see mannequin piss in the background.
Yeah, these reviews were bonkers.
No amount of urine can make this game viable.
Flights of Fantasy reviews were almost avant-garde art. You had no idea what was coming next. It's actually difficult to show just what a fever dream they were without playing one review in its entirety. There was a weirdly specific focus on technical analysis of how a game was developed, which the vast majority of the audience watching did not care about or understand. Some reviews started off kind of normal, but George had a propensity to randomly start describing how to beat the game in excruciating detail as if he were making a walkthrough rather than a review. George also had no filter whatsoever and never tried to be objective, as I'm sure you can tell.
Donkey Kong Country is truly perfect. If you do not get this amazing new generation of Donkey Kong madness, you are stupid. Yes, I know, that's insulting, but it's also the truth.
But the really weird thing about all this was these reviews were almost hypnotic and kind of fun to watch. Things were just professional enough that it seemed as though they were something a real media outlet might put out. But media outlets aren't this opinionated, or petty, or flat out wrong in their criticism. George was clearly an outsider to an industry he was pretending to be an expert in. He was sometimes just taking his own personal opinions and packaging that as if it were content. He'd fill episodes with weird, unfunny skits that distracted from the review at hand. Personal biases leaked through everything that came out of his mouth. He got kind of better at camera work and scripting as the show went on, but in a way that was clearly from an amateur just teaching himself everything, and this weird, opinionated mess of a show actually got an audience that found it fun and interesting to watch, all because they kind of liked George. I mean, George Wood was, honestly, a YouTuber. YouTube is such a natural part of life today, it's kind of hard to look back and realize just how much it really changed the world of media. Like, if you wanted to make a TV show or movie before the internet, you basically had to navigate a monolithic industry, since shows and movies require so much money and so many people to actually get made. You needed people because no single person makes a show. For any feature to get produced, you need directors, writers, producers, actors, set designers, hair and makeup, camera operators, and a million other hands on set just to get the filming portion done, not to mention an entire post-production team to take what you shot and actually put it all together. Plus, this all needs to be financed ahead of time. You need a lot of money, all these people have salaries, and if you don't have millions of dollars sitting in a personal bank account, that means you're gonna have to take your idea to a production studio and convince them to give you millions of dollars to make your idea. This is weird. No other art form is like this. Normally, making art just means creating something and showing it to others. But video content has never been that simple. All of the people and money involved in production naturally prevent any video from being too raw. Even if you get a really great idea for a movie or show, leading a team of hundreds of people trying to get them to make the show look exactly like what you have inside your head, that's an impossible task. You can always try to take on more responsibility yourself, like if you're the writer, director, editor, lead actor, and art department, that naturally gives you more control, but there's always going to be hundreds and hundreds of more people you have to hire to help you make your film. Before the internet, video could never go straight from creator to audience, which prevented content from ever being too far outside the mainstream, but that's what YouTube changed. What really made YouTube special when it launched in 2005 was how it tore down all those walls. Now, any sort of video creator had a place where they could go and make their ideas with no barriers standing in their way. You didn't need to hire hundreds of people or secure millions in financing. If you had an idea for a goofy sketch, you could just go make it. If you had an idea for a passionate rant, you could go ahead and just do it. If you wanted a show to talk about political opinions, even if they're considered not mainstream, there was nothing stopping you now. We got to see all sorts of creations that never would have seen the light of day if they had to go through the traditional media ecosystem, but those creators were still able to find just as much success as you could imagine. That was really the beauty of YouTube. It suddenly made video just like every other art form, where all you needed was to create something and now you could show it to others. And we get to see all sorts of new things because of it. People tell stories that otherwise never would have seen the light of day. Counterculture ideas challenge the way we view the world. Even niche hobbies can now be given a stage that would be unimaginably large decades ago. And you can make a career yourself out of just talking about these sorts of things, sharing your personal opinions and turning them into content. That's something nobody could have ever experienced before the internet, except in Bowie, Maryland, in 1993.
Welcome to this edition of Flights of Fantasy. I'm your host, George Wood. We've got a jam-packed show for you today. I can't wait to get started.
As easy as it is to laugh at George Wood for some of his predictions and hot takes on gaming, he built an unbelievably successful TV show with them. Flights of Fantasy ran for over 200 episodes, all the way up to the turn of the millennium. Eventually, it involved writers, editors, producers, and guest hosts all working towards sharing George's vision. It's difficult to know how popular FOF was in terms of raw viewership, but George would later go on to claim that it was syndicated nationally on cable and garnered up to 14 million viewers. Ironically enough, even though George started off this show not knowing much about gaming, he ended up becoming pretty damn knowledgeable about the medium during his time on air. FOF episodes were known to get really specific about the technical workings of how games were made and what sort of innovations were around the corner in the industry.
All the backgrounds were created with rendering techniques on the Silicon Graphics computers. This amazing new technology, discovered at Rare by Nintendo's Tony Harmon, will be the next standard in video game animation and graphics.
Yeah, that did mean you might hear 2-minute rants on Silicon Graphics computers in your Toy Story reviews, but it was also a level of knowledge and understanding that most professional journalists at the time didn't seem to grasp. If you were watching FOF when it aired, there's a good chance that they genuinely broke some gaming tech news to you before anyone else did.
With this kind of control, plus the feature of 4 controller ports, the NU64 will bring gaming to a whole new level. Just you wait.
Flights also did some pretty progressive things in its format, like at times they would play large segments of gameplay from whatever video game they were talking about with little editing and no commentary. The idea behind this was to give viewers a true understanding of what they could expect if they ever purchased the game themselves, perhaps a better understanding than what they might find in a cinematic trailer or a text review. That might have sounded like a lazy idea at the time, but with the prevalence of no commentary gameplay videos, and hell, Twitch TV, I think it's fair to say that George was pretty far ahead of his time with that. Flights of Fantasy even managed to get some actual industry sway back when it was originally airing. In 1995, George was invited to and attended E3, an industry-exclusive trade show which normally was just reserved for video game developers and professional journalists. But here George is, speaking with the president of Capcom.
What are your hot products for this year at E3?
I think our biggest product right now, obviously, is Resident Evil, which has been an enormous title for us and for the industry as a whole.
Of all the accomplishments George and Flights managed across those years, though, I think the greatest accomplishment in his mind came in 1994. Earlier on in that year, there was a collectible card game released called Flights of Fantasy. It had no relation to the show at first, and today sits as a widely forgotten project, but it was significant in a couple of ways. Ed Beard Jr., who did much of the artwork for the original Magic the Gathering cards, was the creator, and he did all the art here as well. FOF actually, technically, was the second CCG ever released after Magic. It failed commercially, partially because the gameplay itself wasn't all that fun. It was more of a collectible art pack anyway, but one of those pieces of art, called the Cosmic Adjudicator, bears a striking resemblance to our hero. George Wood was weirdly a big deal. All good things must come to an end though, and at the start of the millennium, so too did Flights of Fantasy. Flights was briefly taken off public access and broadcast across the internet in 2001 through FOFTV.com, which actually makes George and his show the first ever online gaming review show, a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself. But soon after that, Flights would end its run. That might leave you asking, how do we know about this show? How do we know it ever existed at all? If it only aired on weird public access cable channels and through a specific internet domain in the 90s and 2000s, how do we have footage of this show today? In 2005, the internet saw the release of YouTube, and of course not long after that, all sorts of gaming videos begun flooding the site. One of the most popular forms of gaming content in those early years, of course, was the infamous Let's Play, where a guy or group of friends would just record themselves playing through a video game and maybe giving some minimal reactions. Let's Plays were a form of content that varied pretty wide in quality. So a few years later, in response to all sorts of bad Let's Plays being uploaded, there was a YouTube channel created called Detsuplay, which was a sort of parody channel that had a group of friends who watched bad Let's Plays and other low-effort gaming content and reacted in a sort of Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of way. And in 2008, they found George Wood.
All right, Navigator, let's find out what this is all about.
He's missing a what the?
Battletoads?
I did not beat Battletoads.
Gaming in the Clinton years.
Look out,
fuck?
Dr. Riley. Huh? We're storming your techno-towering castle and fighting
Techno-towering what?
The trick is to aim.
You know, this is a professional thing, but they couldn't have gotten a less nerdy guy.
Ball and kick it towards the
They're
head.
always nerdy.
But don't forget to anticipate the angle of the dangle when the ball
angle of the...
I'm glad he chose such a notoriously difficult game as Mega Man 8.
Gelatinous. Bill Cosby would find him quite tasty. Oh, wait a minute. I'm thinking of the pudding commercials. No, I'm right. He does Jell-O commercials too. Anyway, wait until the eye opens inside the jelly body.
Navgister.org.
Can I give him hints on good URLs to pick?
Can I give him hints on the use of vowels in your name?
Can I give him hints on how to do an LP?
How are 3 entities
hints.
involved in this?
What they had stumbled across was a YouTube channel named Navigator, which is just an acronym that stands for the National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers, an awards show that gives out yearly prizes for outstanding achievement in the gaming industry. But weirdly enough, this channel, early on into YouTube's lifespan, begun uploading the old game reviews from Flights of Fantasy episodes with a new title, Gaming in the Clinton Years. It's weird that this old public access show managed to survive and resurface on the internet, but what might be even more weird was how successful and popular these reviews became. Detsuplay loved watching and reacting to these videos, naturally drawing their own audience to check it out themselves, but somehow even more people managed to keep on stumbling across them over the years to a point where some reviews have some pretty impressive view counts, with most people seeming to genuinely like them. If you ever check out the comments in any video, you'll see that some people are just talking about the game that George is reviewing, as if nothing is strange about the review at all. Others actually praise some of the critique that he gives and says that he's weirdly right and nuanced in his review. Of course, you will still find some negative comments just making fun of him, but the vast majority are pretty positive and fairly supportive. Gaming in the Clinton years was actually getting a decent internet fan base. Before long, certain reviews started racking up hundreds of thousands of views, some of them getting millions, even though this was all originating from a show that aired more than a decade earlier, talking about games that were no longer in the public consciousness. Fast forward to the late 2010s, and a YouTuber named TJ the Emperor starts a multi-video series released over the course of 3 years, all dedicated to uncovering the mysteries and businesses behind Flights of Fantasy and George Wood. Eventually, another Wood fan creates an entire Twitter account titled No Context Gaming in the Clinton Years, where they post some of the hilarious comments and one-liners that George has said.
You will open up hidden levels for the 4-player minigames, which we can't show you because we only have one controller.
Still later in 2020, popular YouTuber Cat Icarus discovers the channel and makes a huge video dedicated to ripping into George, filled with plenty of goofy skits. Hang on. I feel like I've seen this somewhere before. A lot of what you might find on George today is a series of jokes, insults, a cult-like fan base who likes to follow these reviews because of the absurdity and maybe just how bad they think they are. But as much as YouTubers may like to make fun of George, I think he deserves a little respect. He was the original, the first guy to take talking about video games and turning that into a career. He was an industry outsider who knew very little about gaming, armed with nothing but opinions, hot takes, and hobbyism, yet somehow he managed to become an influential journalist and commentator within said industry, all done a decade before the invention of YouTube. Anyone who makes independent content can almost look up to him as a patron saint, an inspirational figure to aspire to be like. He accomplished more in the 1990s than what many independent creators would die to achieve today. And the best part of all this was he wasn't doing this to get rich, or for the influence, or to get famous, or anything like that, which we know because he didn't stop. After Flights of Fantasy came to a close, George Wood continued working in creative production. He created a few public access parody game shows that normally poked fun at Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. One was titled Who Wants to See My Derriere, where after contestants won a trivia game, they would go around a curtain and get to see George Wood's rear end.
Sean has won the prize.
Another was a bit more serious, as it was a political-themed parody. In the year 2000, there was an international custody battle over a boy named Elian Gonzalez. At age 5, he and his mother escaped Cuba by way of the United States, although his mother drowned in the process. He was eventually taken in by relatives in Miami, Florida, but was then extradited back to Cuba to be reunited with his father after a series of very lengthy and public court cases. George Wood responded to all this by creating a show called Who Wants to Go Back to Cuba, where the winners would be raided by INS agents and presumably deported.
D, Daddy loves you so much he couldn't wait any longer and he's sorry.
That's right, it is correct, and you are going back
with
Cuba whether you or not.
Later on, he would get involved with gaming again, as in the year 2001, George Wood founded the National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers, which kind of explains why they would be the one to publish his content to the internet. And since then, he and his works have gone on an insane, wild ride. In the year 2006, George faked his own death, saying he died of a drug overdose. He got involved with a series of gamer cruises that may or may not have actually happened. He possibly got involved with a series of Hollywood documentary productions, as seen on the Discovery Channel. He made some unbearably cringeworthy on-the-street interviews before then going off to start another caucus-style awards show that kind of competed with his first awards show that still hosts all of his old reviews to this day, except for one period in time when they deleted all of his content and then re-uploaded it in a huge alternate reality game. And, I mean, he wasn't getting anything out of this. George wasn't getting rich or famous. Most of these projects got very little attention, if anyone paid attention to them at all. It's almost a miracle that most of this footage still exists. He was just making these shows because, I don't know, he must have just really liked making them. And even today, he still has not stopped. The last update we have on George, he currently sits on the board of directors at BCMC, the Bowie Community Media Corporation. That's the old public access channel where he started it all. He's still there producing shows and currently sits as the secretary of the board. In 1993, George Wood quit his job. At the time, he was 38 years old and had been working at a patent office in Washington, D.C. Later on, he would claim he spent 26 years in total working in the patent industry, and by all accounts, he had a stable job and a successful career. Yet, at 38 years old, he gave it all up, quitting his 9-to-5, changing his career trajectory to just talk about comics and video games. That's an insane thing to do. That's an insane thing to do today, giving up your life's work to try and do something like become a YouTuber, the 1 in a million odds you hit it big. But to do that in 1993? That's incomprehensible. Before you had the reach of the internet at your disposal, before YouTube, before anyone on Earth had ever seen a person make a living out of just talking about video games, with random bad takes, hilariously wrong predictions, goofy, unfunny skits, all as an unbelievably unqualified individual, to give up your career for such a ridiculous dream, you've got to be crazy to attempt something like that. But believe it or not, that's not even the most surprising part of this story. The craziest thing to me is, in the world of media today, nothing lasts for long. Top TV shows will be forgotten before you know it, blockbusters never stay on top of the box office forever, the top 40 charts in music are always constantly changing. Even on YouTube, the stars you see trending today will end up being as forgotten as Fred before you know it. So how has this been the man who's managed to stay relevant all these years? This story I've been telling you, it's been unfolding since 1993. It's now 2022. That's 29 years, almost 3 decades, and people are still watching him. Every generation that's come across George loves him. They love his show. They can't stop watching it. He's so unbelievably entertaining. There's something just mystical about this man. How is this the person who's found that level of success? How are we still watching? Why can we not stop watching? Perhaps the best way to describe George comes from the first YouTube channel to discover him, when, while they were watching some of his videos and laughing about it, one of the hosts commented,
I can't get enough of this guy.
Well, listen, folks, I hope you have a great Christmas. We'll leave you with Titanic. I'll see you next year.